just me and my bad spending habits. As you may or may not know, I skipped college 3.5 years ago, and now I live in Manhattan, New York City, one of, if not the most expensive cities to live in. So today I thought it might be fun to break down my monthly expenditures living in New York City. Now I know there are tons of videos that do exactly this, but most of them in my experience are limited to a day or a week of expenses, and I feel like that doesn't give an accurate overview of the average cost of living of a single city. So what I have done is I have tracked my expenses for not 1, but 2 months living in New York City. Now, I've done this for 2 reasons. The first one is that in my last video, I talked about money saving strategies, and one of those strategies was to track your expenses in a spreadsheet. So that is what I have done here. And today I kind of wanted to see if it actually made a difference in my spending habits. And the second reason is to show how expensive it really is to live in New York City. As I mentioned, I feel like a lot of the videos out there don't give an accurate representation of the average cost of living. So I wanted to kind of compare and contrast 2 drastically different months. Back in December, it was Christmas, it was holidays, I was spending a lot of money, whereas in January, I really buckled down on my expenses. And so we have kind of both ends of the extreme in terms of monthly expenditures, but at the end, I hope to kind of consolidate both of these and come to an average number as to how much money I'm spending in a month. Now, quick disclaimer, I'm not going to be talking about constant expenditures, so that basically means my rent and my utilities. After I reach 1,000 subscribers, maybe we can talk about that, but for now, suffice to say that it hurts. It hurts my wallet. It's a lot of money, but it's New York. So anyway, let's just get on to the monthly expenditures. Starting with the month of December. As I mentioned, this was a particularly extravagant month because it was the holidays, so I had people over and I was buying Christmas presents, and so that basically meant that I spent way more money than I should have, which totaled a whopping $2,699.39 in just monthly expenses. Again, not including rent, not including utilities, just me and my bad spending habits. So I broke down these expenses into 10 different categories. The first category, where I spent the most amount of money, totaling 34.5% of my total expenses, was shopping. So in December, I spent $932 on shopping. Again, it was Christmas, so literally 500 of those dollars was dedicated towards one person's Christmas present. I totally have a favorite, but the rest was attributed to other Christmas presents, also buying just like cookware so that I could host a Christmas dinner, which I had never done before. So it was definitely a painful month in terms of shopping. Now, the second largest category, totaling 23.9% of my expenditure, was food. And in the food category, I spent $646.46. Now, there's a difference between food and groceries. For me, food means eating out or going to the grocery store and buying a pastry, something that I can't really use over a long period of time, whereas groceries is more like things that I would use to cook at home, right? So obviously this category could definitely use some work. Again, I talked in my last video about how rent and food are kind of the biggest categories where people spend a lot of money, and clearly I'm no exception. But that does bring me into the third largest category, which was groceries. Groceries totaled 11% of my expenses, or $314 in total. Now, again, I really thought that I could probably bring this number down. If you want to know some ways on how to do that, check out my last video, but I really challenged myself in the month of January to bring that grocery bill down. Now, I'm going to speed through the remaining categories because I feel like they're not that interesting, but 10% basically of my expenses went towards coffee, which is $252 of, lattes and Starbucks. Again, not a great spending habit. The other ones were entertainment, transportation, subscriptions. I had a miscellaneous category. I don't really remember what I put in that. And then recurring expenses, I guess, would be like my renter's insurance. Now, I did the math in terms of how much I was spending on a daily basis, which, as you know, is basically just the total sum of my expenses divided by the number of days in the month, which brought me to a daily average expenditure of $87.08. Now, I know what you're thinking, that is a lot, and I really thought so also, which is why in the month of January, I really tried to buckle down on my expenses. So let's take a look at those. Again, in this month, I was actively tracking my expenses at the end of each day instead of just looking back retroactively like I did in the month of December in an attempt to try to bring down my daily costs. And so I was also just, trying to reduce things like eating out and getting coffee every day, which did actually help because my total expenditure for the month of January was $1,152.41. Now, it's still New York, so, $1,100 ain't nothing, but given where I started in the previous month, that is a huge, huge improvement. I still broke them down by category to see what changed. Most notably, I didn't do any shopping in the month of January. Makes sense because I didn't have Christmas presents, but I also reduced shopping habits like buying stuff online or thrift shopping, which are some of my kind of more average shopping habits. This meant that for the month of January, my biggest expense category was actually food. And so food took up 27% of my total expenses and totaled $315.60. Now, the second largest category didn't actually exist in the month of December, and that was travel. I didn't travel in December, I guess my family came to me, but in the month of January I had a business trip, and then I also stopped back home on my way back from that business trip. So in the month of January, I spent $190 on travel, which was about 16.5% of my monthly expenses. Now, the third largest category was entertainment. And so what that meant is that in the month of January, I started playing in a volleyball league, an adult volleyball league, which charged me a fee. And then I think I also bought an HBO Max subscription that I plan on canceling, but I gotta have my fun sometimes. But that basically meant that I spent $188 on those types of miscellaneous entertainment expenditures. Now, it's worth noting that because I brought my total expenses down, the percentage of expenses for each of these categories is going to be affected drastically. So in the month of December, because I spent more than, $2,500, if I spent $188 on entertainment, that was going to be a much, much smaller proportion of the total expenses, whereas by bringing everything else down and making the largest expenses so much smaller, entertainment is going to take up a bigger chunk of the overall pot. And then the fourth largest category was groceries. I spent $170 on groceries, so I brought down my bill by almost half, I think. Which was great. And I still spent money on coffee, so I spent about $100 on coffee, which was 8% of my expenses. And even though I still think that I could bring that number further in the months going forward, that was still a decrease of more than 50%. So I'll take the win where I can. And speeding through the remaining categories, I had subscriptions, transportation, miscellaneous again, career. I spent some money on things like courses that I wanted to take or marketing experiments that I was running, and lastly, insurance or recurring expenses. So again, I made the daily calculation of how much money I was spending given my monthly expenses, and my daily average expenditure came up to $37.17. I do think personally that I can get that number down even further, but given where I started and given the delta, I'm pretty proud of myself. Now, before I give you the average monthly cost of living in New York City, I wanted to do a quick comparison of the expenses in December versus the expenses in January and how much I was able to save just by tracking my expenses. Obviously, there were some categories that were not consistent month to month, so travel existed in the month of January but not December, and conversely, shopping existed in December but not January. So those things were a bit difficult to gauge, but given that shopping was such a massive expense, that was a huge way to save money. But I was still able to save significantly in some other areas of my life. Eating out, so food, and also coffee were two of the biggest areas that saw a decrease in expenditure. So in terms of eating out and food, my monthly expenditure went down 51%. And in terms of getting coffee, that expense went down 60%. Even in other areas that are a bit harder to manipulate, like groceries and travel, I still decreased my grocery bill by 45%, and my travel bill went down, my transportation bill went down by 65.94%. Now, again, my last video talks about some ways to do that, but in terms of transportation specifically, I think the biggest way that I did that was just by walking more and taking fewer Ubers. Not that I do that very often, but again, the month of December was a bit of a special occasion. I won't really do a detailed breakdown of the remaining categories, but as I mentioned, all in all, on average, my entire monthly expenses went down by 57%. Just by tracking my expenses and being a little bit more conscious of spending. So, given these two completely diametrically opposed months, my extravagant Christmas extravaganza in December versus my New Year's resolution trying to be more conscious of spending in January, I took both of those monthly expenses and came up with an average monthly expenditure of $1,925 living in New York City in a month. Again, that does not include rent or utilities, and that's also just one person's experience living in New York City. I am neither the most frugal nor the most spendy, but hopefully that gives you a pretty accurate and honest representation of what it takes to live in one of the most expensive cities in the world. If you yourself are interested in learning a little bit more about how to save money, check out my last video, and as always, good luck out there.